Today on the Word Preacher podcast, Korihor the Antichrist, a legal approach and a spiritual approach. I'm Brett Jensen, and this is the Word Preacher podcast. Right. This week, our Come Follow Me material brings us to Alma chapters 30 and 31. We're going to just focus on Alma 30. We're going to talk about Korihor. Let's dig right in. We're going to look at a few verses in Alma chapter 30, starting with verse 6. But it came to pass in the latter end of the 17th year, there came a man into the land of Zarahemla, and he was Antichrist. For he began to preach unto the people against the prophecies which had been spoken by the prophets concerning the coming of Christ. All right, now if we skip down a few verses, I'd like to tack on verses 12 through 16. And this Antichrist, whose name was Korihor, and the law could have no hold upon him, began to preach unto the people that there should be no Christ. And after this manner did he preach, saying, O ye that are bound down under a foolish and a vain hope, why do ye yoke yourselves with such foolish things? Why do ye look for a Christ? For no man can know of anything which is to come. For behold, these things which ye call prophecies, which ye say are handed down by holy prophets, behold, they are foolish traditions of your fathers. How do ye know of their surety? Behold, ye cannot know of things which ye do not see. Therefore ye cannot know that there shall be a Christ. Ye look forward and say that ye see a remission of your sins, but behold, it is the effect of a frenzied mind. And this derangement of your mind comes because of the traditions of your fathers, which lead you away into a belief of things which are not so. Okay, so here's Korihor. This is what he's preaching. That's his deal. What is his motivation for doing this? Like if a bunch of people believe in Jesus, even if you don't think that that's true, why go out and preach against it? What is motivating Korihor? Well, we get a little insight to that if we look at verses 17 and 18, which read as follows. And many more such things did he say unto them, telling them that there could be no atonement made for the sins of men, but every man fared in this life according to the management of the creature. Therefore every man prospered according to his genius, and that every man conquered according to his strength. And whatsoever a man did was no crime. And thus he did preach unto them, leading away the hearts of many, causing them to lift up their heads in their wickedness, yea, leading away many women and also men to commit whoredoms, telling them that when a man was dead, that was the end thereof. So there it is. All of this, your religion doesn't matter, your sense of morality doesn't matter, your church is bad. It's all getting towards he wants to have people commit whoredoms. This is actually a really common thing where people claim to have many religious concerns, but in fact, it's not a religious concern. It's a concern about something else, either feeling guilty about something and wanting to justify it, feeling angry about something and wanting to justify that. There's no other reason that you would go and attack someone for believing in something other than you feel some sort of compulsion that it needs to be wrong. This is true even today. You don't see them going and protesting Buddhists, but you do see them protesting members of the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, how do you deal with this? We kind of know in the back of our minds with the benefit of hindsight, having read the whole chapter, what his motivation is. That it's not an honest attack or legitimate concerns. He has ulterior motives here. How do you deal with that? There are a couple of approaches. And Mormon takes a bit of time explaining that Korihor was within his legal rights to do what he did. If we're thinking about a legal approach for shutting Korihor down, this is kind of important. Let's look at a couple of verses. Now, there was no law against a man's belief, for it was strictly contrary to the commands of God that there should be a law which should bring men onto unequal grounds. For thus saith the Scripture, choose ye this day whom ye will serve. Now, if a man desired to serve God, it was his privilege, or rather, if he believed in God, it was his privilege to serve him. But if he did not believe in him, there was no law to punish him. But if he murdered, he was punished unto death. And if he robbed, he was also punished. And if he stole, he was also punished. And if he committed adultery, he was also punished. Yea, for all this wickedness they were punished. For there was a law that men should be judged according to their crimes. Nevertheless, there was no law against a man's belief. Therefore, a man was punished only for the crimes which he had done. Therefore, all men were on equal grounds. So this passage, that was verses 7 through 11. And Mormon takes the time to explain this before he clarifies that Korihor, the law could have no hold upon him. So what is the point of setting this legal framework up as Mormon is making his abridgment? Why was it a big deal that he was working within the legal framework provided? I think it provides a little context for what happens next. Let's read some verses. This is verses 19 through 23. Now this man, meaning Korihor, went over to the land of Jershon also to preach these things among the people of Ammon, who were once the people of the Lamanites. But behold, they were more wise than many of the Nephites, for they took him and bound him and carried him before Ammon, who was a high priest over that people. And it came to pass that he caused that he should be carried out of the land. And he came over to the land of Gideon, and began to preach unto them also. And here he did not have much success, for he was taken and bound, and carried before the high priest, and also the chief judge over the land. And it came to pass that the high priest said unto him, Why do ye go about perverting the ways of the Lord? Why do ye teach this people that there shall be no Christ, to interrupt their rejoicings? Why do ye speak against all the prophecies of the holy prophets? Now the high priest's name was Giddonah, and Korihor said unto him, Because I do not teach the foolish traditions of your fathers, and because I do not teach this people to bind themselves down under the foolish ordinances and performances which are laid down by ancient priests, to usurp power and authority over them, to keep them in ignorance, that they may not lift up their heads, but be brought down according to thy words. Okay, so that's verses 19 through 23. Goes to the people of Ammon, immediately bound, brought before Ammon, kicked out. Goes to other places, and even without success, he's bound, but they still want to hear his case. Ultimately, he goes before Alma, who is the high priest over all of the land, and also the chief judge. And so, like, we'll get to the part where he stands before Alma a little bit later, but talking about why were the people of Ammon more wise than the Nephites? Why was the wisest course of action to bind him up, take him to the high priest, and kick him out? This seems like, if we're going purely on a legal thing, that, isn't that sort of what they did with the sons of Mosiah, or with Alma? that they were bound and kicked out and rejected, and that was a bad thing to come preaching religion, or to prevent people from preaching religion. But in this case, it was the wise thing. Even though it was established, it was without legal authority. The law could have no hold on him. The people just rounded him up and kicked him out. So why is Mormon praising their wisdom? I think that this is a very important question as we're looking at the story of Korihor. Certainly in modern times, there is a great deal of attention that our society gives to political authority. And some of that is just a matter of convenience. If the news media is reporting on a problem, having an authority figure through whom all of these things can be discussed provides an easier place to report on solutions to problems, as opposed to what if the solution is every single person everywhere gets convinced of something. And that's a little tough to ask individuals to be accountable and still persuade them to buy your stuff. And so some of this is just convenience. Some of it is more than that. They expect that government authorities actually will solve many problems, whether or not there's legal authority to do so. And this is even rubbed off on people at large who expect politicians and governments to handle even non-political problems or things that have no bearing on the law. And politicians, in exchange for power, particularly if they depend on vote and popularity, they are more than willing to tell people that any particular problem is due to some enemy that is seeking to oppress, and that they will implement policies to, quote unquote, fight back. In other words, in order for political figures to have efficacy, they need to be seen overcoming resistance. No one thinks, oh, this was a great politician because, they didn't have to do anything and it was okay. Frequently, we look at politicians who overcame something. And it's no wonder that American presidents like George Washington or Abraham Lincoln are revered because of what they had to overcome, with no precedent establishing what they did. They made very difficult decisions and ultimately were largely successful and made positive impacts on the nation. In order for political figures to have this efficacy, they frequently emphasize, as they campaign, the flaws of their opponents and their own utopian vision that could be realized if only it weren't for those meddling politicians who disagree, the other side. In other words, they need opposition, and not just any opposition that's in the realm that they're seeking power and authority for, political opposition. The people of Ammon, though, they used a high priest, Ammon, but they really didn't hear any case like the Nephites. They just kicked Korihor out. Now, it's not because there wasn't a political situation or that there was no opposition. It's what the opposition was. And so frequently in modern politics, we focus on a left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, or authoritarian versus libertarian. These political spectrums and compasses that indicate how people are opposed to one another and how to further one's political agendas. But these are not the most important forms of opposition, and it's not the lens through which all things ought to be viewed. That's not to say it's never useful. There's a place for politics, but there is a more important opposition. The original opposition, which is good and evil. the human experience. Mortality was designed around getting us to understand that good is good and evil is evil, that we should learn to prize good and abhor evil. And this conflict is not something that can be codified into legal versus illegal, left versus right, conservative versus liberal. Some people try to explain that the people of Ammon were wise in Mormon's assessment because they rejected quote-unquote hate speech or some other modern legal assessment of what Korihor was doing. That's not at all what they were doing. They were wise because they recognized Korihor not as a legal issue. They saw him in terms of good versus evil. Long-standing traditions and shared culture in the United States once allowed us to understand and respect similar problems with the good versus evil prism, mindset, paradigm. For example, prayers and scriptures in public are good. Pornography and having children outside of the marriage covenant are bad. But it's difficult in a more modern and progressive society, which is no longer culturally in tune with these good and evil decisions, to see them as good or bad only in terms of legal or illegal, progressive or conservative. This is not a great prism through which to view the world. We would be wiser if we could recognize Korihor as being evil and understanding that sin is wrong, that what Korihor was doing, what he was convincing people to do, was bad. And we don't need to listen to his arguments before we make that decision. We understand that it's evil. So even though it seems like a double standard to allow preachers of religion like Alma and the Sons of Mosiah to come and share their messages, the messages are different. We accept good and we reject evil. Which brings us to the spiritual approach to Korihor, because the legal approach was not working. And as we mentioned before, Korihor eventually comes before Alma the high priest and makes all of his accusations that the leaders of the church are trying to control the people by teaching good versus evil, that they were glutting themselves with the labors of others, that they could not know the fundamental spiritual claims of their faith because these things could not, they're unfalsifiable. They can't be proven. You see all of these arguments today. You see people accusing President Nelson and the apostles of doing every one of these things. Ironically, Korihor was guilty of every one of these things. He wanted to convince people to fornicate with him to slake his own lust. He was trying to control people by teaching that good versus evil was a lie. He was sustained by the contributions of his followers, glutting himself with the labors of others. He was affirming that there was no life after death, without being able to provide any proof or visible or tangible evidence to support his conclusion that death was the end. He did everything he accused his opponents of doing. Alma's response. He didn't really want to put up with Korihor. He stuck to his testimony. This wasn't a logical argument. This wasn't based on premises and what supporting evidence could be put up to support such premises. He said, all things denote there is a God. This should be obvious to you, and I know it's true, and I think you know it as well. So, What does Korihor do? He asks for a sign. Of course, the adulterer would ask for a sign. And Alma finally suggests that maybe for a sign, God will strike him dumb. Korihor becomes completely unable to speak. And then suddenly, after this sign, he admits, oh yeah, I was wrong. If you undo it, that would be really great. But the sign is not undone. And I think that's kind of important too. He went around spending his time as an instrument of evil. Pretending that good and evil didn't exist, he went around convincing people to do bad things. He was literally an instrument of evil, encouraging people away from Christ and towards sin. And now, at his own demand, he would become an instrument of good in making plain the incorrect nature of his teachings and barring him from being able to justify his teachings. There would be no excuses. He could not speak. Ultimately, kind of a sad end to Korihor. He went among the Zoramites, ended up being trampled to death as a beggar. The conclusion to the story is kind of tragic, but it can still serve as an important lesson for all readers of the Book of Mormon who are around today and can see the parallels between what was happening then and what is happening today. The spiritual response to a challenge of your faith is to not throw away your faith and testimony. These things are valid. Don't let anyone who doesn't accept them or claims that it's the effect of a frenzied mind to listen to the Holy Spirit or doesn't demands proof make you feel like your testimony doesn't count. Treasure your testimony. It comes from God. Seek your relationship from Him. It's fine to not lean on others, but hold to your testimony. Also, the most important context through which to view anything is good versus evil. And it is vital that we not forsake that prism, but embrace it. In fact, improve it. Learn to recognize what is good. Learn to recognize what is not good. Hold to that which is good. These are the things that will bring you closer to Christ. And finally, Korihor was not a one-time deal. Be aware of false teachers and modern antichrists who would seek to draw you away from Jesus. In the end, everyone needs Christ. We appreciate all the support for the Word Preacher podcast. Next week, we will look at Alma chapters 32 through 35, talking about faith, prayer, humility, and the Zoramites. Of course, there's a lot we did not cover in our reading this week. Please make sure you study this. And as always, fight on.